My name's Edward Anderson, and I'm a great grandchild of Roland Hartley. And Sanford Wright asked me to stop by and talk a little bit about what I knew as far as the history of the family logging and sawmilling operations, which I've had an interest in since I was actually pretty young. Back in probably late junior high, high school. I remember my grandfather, Edward Hartley, talking to me about it and showing me pictures of the logging and of timber cruising and of the mills. And I remember quite a bit about what my grandfather told me and showed me. I had an interest in the history then, and I actually attended the University of Washington College of Forest Resources. I graduated in 1981 with a degree in forest engineering and worked in the woods myself in Snohomish County, eastern Snohomish County, back in the late 70s when we were still logging old growth. And so I did that for 3 summers, actually logged in the old growth. So I have a pretty keen appreciation for the history of the family logging operations, because even though I was logging 70 years after they were well established, a lot of the terminology, a lot of the technologies really they were the same in the late 1970s as they were in 1908. So I had an interest in that, and what I was going to do is start back in the very beginning and talk a little bit about Roland's life from what I know back in New Brunswick, where he was born in 1864, and talk about what I know during that period of his life and what I know when he moved on to Minnesota. And then obviously the most knowledge that I have would be after his relocation to the Pacific Northwest. From what I know of Roland's life back in New Brunswick, the majority of it I learned from reading a document just recently that was provided to me by Jane Kingston, a cousin of mine, and her dad, David Hartley, was a grandson of Guilford Hartley, who was Roland's older brother. And Guilford, I don't know if he was the oldest of the kids in the family, but he was quite a bit older than Roland. And he left Minnesota before Roland did and came down to the Minnesota area, and he got heavily involved in logging and doing the log drives, moving the logs to market on the Mississippi there down in the Minneapolis area, where I think the majority of the mills were back then in that region. But from what I know from reading this document prepared by David Hartley, I think it was written back in the mid-1980s. It was probably about 70 pages, and it appeared he did a lot of research to try to really understand what life was like back, in that region at that time. And I mean, the document goes all the way back to Roland's great-grandfather, who was, I think his name was George, I think Adkins Hartley, and he was a loyalist during the Revolutionary War and fought for the British. I think he was actually wounded a few times. And at the end of the Revolutionary War, I think the British were really pretty good about supporting and looking after the loyalists that had remained loyal to England during the war and fought for the British. And shortly after the war, the British really mobilized. And I think they took about 30,000 loyalists up into Canada, and I think the majority of them settled in the St. John's River Valley. I think New Brunswick might have been created, especially for those loyalists moving up into Canada at that time. But Roland's great-grandfather, George, settled up there, and Roland was born there in 1864. And I think the life back then, the way it really worked is you worked in the summers, you worked on the farm and you worked with livestock In the winters when it was cold and snow was on the ground, they logged. They cut timber, and they moved the timber to the rivers where they could transport the logs to market. So when Roland's older brother Guilford left Canada and came down to Minnesota, that's essentially what he did. He started just as a laborer, and I think he was, in the Minnesota area, and he had ambition and confidence, and sounded like he was good at what he did, and he eventually worked his way up, I think fairly rapidly, and was an owner, and had his own camps, and took the risk to buy the timber, log it, and get it to market. And it was risky business, but there was a lot of money to be made if you were good at it, and I'm sure there was some luck involved, but I think he was pretty successful. So I would assume that when Roland left New Brunswick and came down to the United States, and I think he was about 14 from what I've read, I would assume that he probably worked for his brother Guilford in Minnesota. I'm not positive of that, but I think that's probably what he did. And from what I've heard, and I've read it in a lot of places, he started as a cook in the camps, which makes sense. He was a young kid. And that was his beginnings. He came down to the United States in 1878. And that's, from what I understand, that's the first thing that he did. He actually got involved in a lot of other businesses and did a lot of other things before he actually came out to the Pacific Northwest for good, which I think was in like 1902. But while he was back in Minnesota and working, in the logging back there, and you can actually go to the Minneapolis, or not the Minneapolis, but the Minnesota Historical Society webpage, and you can do searches on the Clough and Hartley camp, and there's quite a few digital images there, and I think they came from the James J. Hill collection, photo collection, that was, I think within the last few years, was merged with the Minnesota Historical Society. But there's quite a few pictures of the Clough and Hartley camps back in the Great Lakes states, logging the original old growth oak and timber back there. And it was somewhere during that time period that he became involved with the Cloughs, and I think the Cloughs already were involved with the Hartleys in logging back there. A lot of the pictures on the Minnesota Historical Society page, they're like from the mid-1880s, I believe. And so Roland was involved, with the logging back there. Eventually, began working for his, who became his father-in-law, David Clough. Worked for David Clough as his private secretary. And Clough actually left Minnesota before Roland did. And this was, long after Roland had married his daughter. I think Clough came out to Everett around 1900. And I do remember my grandfather telling me that when David Clough, his grandfather, first came out, he came out in James J. Hill's private rail car, and you can read that in a lot of places. I'm not really sure if Roland came out, at the same time in the initial trips in Hill's rail car or not. I would assume they both made a number of trips out here before they made the final decision to relocate here. But when David Clough first came out, or came out, say, for good, and was involved in setting up the Clark Nickerson Lumber Company, I'd say by 1900, I think he was out here for good. And I think Roland, I think he was back involved in some business activities in the Cass Lake area of Minnesota before he finally relocated out here. And it's my understanding that Roland came out initially by himself, and then his wife, my great-grandmother, and my grandpa, and his little brother David, I think came out about a year later, for good and permanently located out here, and I think they lived on about 18th and Rucker initially. So when Roland first got out here to the Northwest, the first company that he had, from what I've read, was called the Hartley Lovejoy Company. And I don't know who the Lovejoy was. I'm not sure who that person was. I'm sure a person could figure it out, but I've just never done the research or taken the time to figure it out. But I think it was 1902 when they established that company, and he began logging out here in the Pacific Northwest. And I've got quite a few photographs of that initial operation. And the initial operation was on the lower Snoqualmie River, really near where the confluence of the Skykomish and the Snoqualmie are. The closest town at the time was Monroe, probably still is. And Roland, he must have enjoyed photography. He took a lot of pictures in the early years of the logging and timber cruising activities. And he was really good at documenting what they were doing, who was in the picture, when it was taken, the date, sometimes even the time of day, sometimes even the camera information on what the camera settings were. And I think sometimes he had professional photographers in the camps. Darius Kinsey was in some of the camps, and I've been able to find some of those pictures, like through the Whatcom County Museum of History and Art, in addition to all the photos that were handed down to me through my grandfather, Edward. In the early 1980s, I spent a fair amount of energy trying to relocate or gather up a lot of the early pictures of the logging and the mills. And my mom helped me and contacted a lot of her cousins. And we were able to get a hold of a lot of the original pictures from cousins from my mom's generation that were all spread out over the country at that time, in Minnesota, New York, Connecticut, California. And we were able to get the whatever originals they had, and I took them down to Seattle to a place called Pro Lab and had 4x5-inch copy negatives made. So over the years I accumulated quite a few pictures. I'm actually still accumulating them, and even within the last 6 months I've obtained more. So there was quite a bit of photo coverage of Roland's first operation when he got out here and was logging on the lower Snoqualmie. And it was interesting to me because it was a ground skidding operation with steam donkeys and using steel wire rope on a big steam donkey, and they were reaching back into the forest. One of the photos says they had 18,500 feet of cable on the main donkey on the banks of the Snoqualmie. And the way those logging operations were laid out, I mean, if you're stretching back into the woods 18,000 feet, I mean, it's not perfectly flat, and the train isn't straight and just laying there waiting for you. I mean, you got to do a fair amount of engineering, and you've got to build bridges, you've got to do excavations and create through cuts. They built flumes. I mean, it was really quite a labor-intensive, costly operation just getting it set up. And then along that main line, they'd have smaller steam donkeys, so that if you looked at it, say from an aerial view, it looked kind of like a fishbone pattern, with the backbone of the fish being your main skid road, and then you've got small call them spur roads coming off to the side that would have their own steam donkeys that would take the timber and bring it out to the main skid road. where they'd be hooked up on the main line and brought down to the Snoqualmie, where they'd throw them in the river and brand them and raft them down the Snoqualmie into the Snohomish and into Everett, where the mills were. And it was quite a bit different back then than it is today. I mean, today when they raft logs, they take them, in truckload quantity with steel bands around them, approximately 5,000 board feet to a bundle. And all the log rafts you see today, they're bundles of logs, all banded together by steel. But back when Roland's first operation was going on the lower Snoqualmie, they were logging, enormous, beautiful, high quality, Douglas fir. And you can see the hammer marks where they'd stamp their symbol on the log around the perimeter of the log on the edges, so that no matter how the log laid in the water, you'd have a side floating up where you could see the stamp, so they could identify the logs when they got down the river. And they had big booming grounds down at the mouth of the Snohomish. Especially in the early years, they had the big booming grounds where the logs would all go down. They'd collect them all down there. I'm not sure by 1902 if it was still working exactly the same way. But by the time Roland got out to the Pacific Northwest in 1902 and got engaged in logging, large-scale logging was starting to get well underway out here. You were starting to get the larger operators with bigger East Coast money or money from the Great Lakes states, because there was that large exodus of timbermen that were leaving the Great Lakes states at that time and relocating out here. So I remember my grandfather talking a lot about the mills. He talked probably mostly about the Clark Nickerson, and next after that would be the Clough Hartley mill. My great-great-grandfather David Clough, my grandpa's grandpa, he was involved in additional mills. I think they had one up in Stanwood. There was maybe a smaller shingle mill up at 14th Street Dock. But the two mills that I really remember my grandfather talking about, and the two that the most was written about, was the Clark Nickerson and the Clough Hartley. And the Clark Nickerson was established first, and I think it might have come online about 1900, give or take a year, when it went into operation. And the Clark Nickerson was, when it was organized, I think one of the primary people organizing the mill was my great-great-grandfather David Clough. Although Roland, he had a financial interest in it just like Clough did. Clough was the main organizer from what I've read and what I recall. I think that at the time Clough was out here, and when he organized the Clark Nickerson, I don't think David Clough had much money at that time. I've read and I remember hearing that he made and lost a fortune before he ever got to Everett. I would assume when he lost the money, because he was fairly successful back in the Great Lakes states in both logging. He was a large logging operator back in the Great Lakes states, and also had the Clough Stinson mill right there on the river in Minneapolis. I would assume they probably lost that in the depression that hit in 1893, which really hit hard out here in Snohomish County, but it was a nationwide depression. So I'm assuming that's where Clough lost his fortune, and the two terms that he served as governor of Minnesota was in the late 1890s. And it's written in the history books, and I certainly remember my grandfather talking about it, that David Clough relocated out here and established the Clark Nickerson mill at the urging of James J. Hill, the founder of the Great Northern Railway. And the Clark Nickerson was at the time was a really, really large mill. I think the capacity when it opened was about, I think it was 300,000 board feet per shift. And in 1900, a mill of that size, I think it was all electric, and it was really state of the art in the Pacific Northwest. And I think it was one of the larger mills at that time in Everett. Eventually it was, surpassed by, mills like Weyerhaeuser's Mill B, which was much, much larger. But at the time in 1900, the Clark Nickerson was a good-sized mill. I remember my grandpa talking about it quite a bit. I remember my mom's oldest sister, Marcia, telling me that she recalls my grandpa telling her that, back in the early part of the 20th century, that my grandpa's grandfather, David Clough, he was kind of a spokesman and kind of a leader for the mill owners. I was up at Providence Medical Center up on North Colby in Everett, not too many years ago, looking at some of their display cases there at the hospital, and they've got one area with some historic display cases where they've got some information on the Everett massacre, and talks a little bit about the people that were injured and treated there. And they have a note that was signed by some of the community leaders back in 1916, at the time of the Everett massacre. And sure enough, it was signed by, I believe it was the mayor, the police chief, and McChesney, who is the fellow that looked after James Hill's interests here in Everett, and then David Clough, who, as my mom's older sister, told me, my aunt, that he really was kind of one of the spokesmen for the mill owners at the time. And then the other mill that was a substantial mill on the Everett waterfront was the Clough Hartley, and I've got actually quite a few photos of both mills that were taken by the family in the early part of the 20th century at various times. And you can tell by the photos that the Clough Hartley, it really changed over time as they probably, added capacity. The Clough Hartley, I think, came online in 1906, and the initial capacity, I think, was 1.3 million shingles per shift, plus 80,000 feet of cedar siding. And I read somewhere that it was the largest shingle mill at the time of Western red cedar shingles. And in the final years, I think, of the Clough Hartley, I believe my grandfather was the general manager of the mill, prior to when the mill ceased operation, probably during the Depression. I remember my grandfather, when I was a kid, I remember his hands. He had an issue with old age in his hands, and his hands were kind of starting to curl up. He couldn't extend his fingers all the way. And I remember he went in for a couple surgeries to have the problem worked on, and they would go in and do some scraping on the bones and try to alleviate the problem. And I remember on one of his surgeries when they were in there, they found a big chunk of cedar. And he mentioned that it had been from an accident when he was younger and working in the mill on one of the cedar machines. And it was very, very dangerous work, working on those cedar machines, cutting the shingles. I remember vividly as a little kid growing up in Everett in the 1960s, and going with my folks to Safeway on 16th and Broadway to get groceries. I remember in the line, standing in the checkout line. I have vivid memories of looking ahead in the checkout line at men, older men, that when they got their wallet out to pay for their groceries, they would be missing, a lot of fingers. And I remember that was really pretty common. You'd see that a lot at the Safeway store. So it was a very dangerous, profession. And, certainly a lot was written about that. One of the photo collections that is probably the most interesting to me was a series of photos that my great-grandfather took in the summer of 1908. And in the summer of 1908, he took his two boys, my grandfather Edward and my grandfather's little brother David, who I always knew as Uncle David. And at that time, my grandpa was like a young teenager, and Uncle David, he wasn't even a teenager yet. And they were cruising timber in the Sultan River watershed, roughly about 4 miles north of where Sultan is today. And they spent about 3 weeks in there cruising timber, and they had a camera, and they took. I couldn't tell you how many photos they took, but they documented 40 on a base map. So, in addition to the 40 photos, they have a base map that breaks the area out into 40-acre parcels. And for each 40-acre parcel on this base map, they list what the volume was of hemlock, fir, and cedar. And they also show the location of each one of the 40 photos where they were taken. And I think I've got about just under 20 of the original photos, and the other 20, I don't know where they are. I don't know if they're lost forever or if they'll ever turn up at some point. But actually, I've got over 20 now, because 3 or 4 new ones turned up just within the last year that I got from a cousin, Jane Kingston, back in Minnesota. And they were actually in a collection of photos that Roland's older brother had, Guilford. So, I mean, they're really cool photos. Roland took a lot of them himself, and a few of them were taken by other people. And what's interesting to me, since, I mean, I've cruised timber, I spent, in my entire career of cruising timber was about 4 months up in southeast Alaska, where I was cruising old growth timber on the Tongass National Forest, and it was a western red cedar, Alaska cedar, Sitka spruce, hemlock. There's no Doug fir up that far north, but the timber that Roland was cruising with his boys was just, I mean, some of it was just enormous, high quality Douglas fir. There's one picture of a stand of timber just south of Woods Lake, where the smallest tree in the stand was 7 feet in diameter. So the Doug fir ranged from 7 to 11 feet in diameter, which is just unheard of today. I don't know, even in the areas where you still have remaining old growth, like Olympic National Park over in the peninsula, or Mount Rainier National Park. A lot of the remaining old growth, pretty high elevation, less favorable growing season, shallower soils. You're probably not even going to find stuff like that anymore. It probably doesn't exist. But, some of the timber that they cruised was just incredible. And it was interesting that for that photo collection in 1908, just incredibly detailed, the information that Roland collected and recorded on the backs of the pictures, actually by typing on them. He had a typewriter with a ribbon with blue ink. My mom remembers it really well. And a lot of the pictures, that's how they were recorded, was with that blue ink. And I mean, Roland would go into the detail of providing the date, time of day, camera settings, who was in the picture, what they were doing. On some of the pictures, he talks about early homesteaders in the area, like in the 1880s. I mean, it's hard to imagine. If you looked at a map of what Snohomish County looked like in the mid 1880s, at a time when Everett didn't even exist, I mean, it's hard to imagine a homesteader would have gone all the way up the Snohomish, up the Skykomish, up the Sultan, and taken a branch off the Sultan and gone off the river, a fair distance to try to burn a hillside off to start a homestead and farm. And Roland would provide insights on, what the heck was the guy thinking? And, how did he get his stuff in here? He had to pack it in. And Roland and his 2 kids found it tough enough just getting in there that summer just to do a simple timber cruise. But that's probably my favorite collection, and I hope that eventually I'll be able to find more of the photos and put the entire collection back together. But that was pretty incredible. And it's pretty apparent to me from things that I remember my grandfather telling me, things that I've read, writings of Roland himself, or things that I've read about him. He really enjoyed the woods. He definitely had a passion and enjoyed the woods. He enjoyed being in the woods. He enjoyed the timber. That was something that was important to him. I kind of get a feeling that he had more of a passion for the woods and the forest than the business of just running the mills. So I think one of the more significant, maybe the most significant logging operation that Roland had was called the Everett Logging Company. And it operated on the Tulalip Reservation between 1915 and 1925. And it was essentially a federal timber sale that he bid on against, I know one of the competitors was the Rucker Brothers, and they bid to log the timber in 1914, and they were the successful low bidder and were awarded the contract. I think the award was in early 1915, and I think they commenced logging operations about the middle of 1915, June or July, and it was a pretty large operation. Roland was one of 3 owners that owned the company. One of the other owners was a Tom Hartley. I don't know if it was Roland's brother or cousin, but there were a lot of different Hartleys and Cloughs involved in logging and sawmilling out here in Snohomish County, in the early part of the 20th century. Just as there were a lot of different Hartleys and Cloughs, I think, involved in the logging, back in the Great Lakes states before they made the move out here. But the Everett Logging Company, which started operations in 1915, logged for 10 years. At the completion of the contract, and one of the contract requirements was they had to be logged out during that 10-year period. They took just under 320 million board feet of timber off the property, and it was essentially the west side of the Tulalip Reservation. The east side, not sure if it was logged at the same time, possibly a little earlier. That was under a contract with Blodell Donovan, I believe, which is another big operator in Washington State back at the time. But I've got a fair number of pictures of the Everett Logging Company, some that were passed down through the family. I picked up quite a few more pictures from a fella that lives out in Marysville whose name is Walt Tobenek. And Walt's kind of a Northwest logging history buff that he did quite a bit of studying on the Everett Logging Company. And he even went to the effort to go down to Seattle and down at West Point there on Lake Washington. there was some Federal Archive facility. I'm not sure if it's still there or not, but I know Walt went down to the Federal Archives and he dug up a lot of information on the Everett Logging Company through the federal government. Since it was a federal timber sale, there was a lot recorded on it, including just general correspondence of Roland's that he has copies of. So I got quite a few photos from Walt. I was able to find a really neat Kinsey print that was in the collection up at Whatcom County Museum of History and Art. And that particular photo, which is really one of the higher quality photos, I think was taken, just somewhere roughly around 1920. And the picture was taken on the up from the shore of Tulalip Bay, maybe 100 feet or so, looking out into Tulalip Bay. And if you're looking, say from the, I guess it would be the Totem area, looking to the west out towards Mission Head, they had a 1,600-foot trestle that ran out into Tulalip Bay that they would back the rail cars down onto the trestle. And from the trestle, they would, push the logs off into Tulalip Bay, and that was their booming grounds, where they would boom the logs prior to transport to the market. And I'm assuming the market was likely the mills in Everett, although I'm not positive. I mean, they could have sold to other mills themselves. Just like I know, Clark Nickerson, it didn't get all of its logs just from family operations. They were a big customer for, what's the big outfit down there in Shelton, Simpson Timber Company, Simpson Logging Company. Clark Nickerson was one of their, big buyers. But it's a really neat photo of the trestle going out into Tulalip Bay, because it looks right over to Mission Head, where I used to spend part of my summers as a kid. My parents would rent a beach cabin right there on the end of Mission Head, and so this photo is looking right across the bay to where I used to spend my summers. But the Everett Logging Company had about a 200-man camp. So at the time, it was really one of the larger operations in that Tulalip, Marysville area. And I was able to get newspaper clippings from Walt Tobenik from the local papers at the time after the Everett Logging Company had received the contract to log that tract of timber. And they barged their camp up from I believe it was the Kenmore area down in Lake Washington, or the Bothell area, where the Everett Logging Company had been operating at the time. And they shut down and barged all their equipment up to Tulalip, where they established that Everett Logging Company. They had, I think, 3 locomotives and operated, I think, maybe 3 logging sides. So I've got some photos of some of the logging crews, running the big steam donkeys. And by that time, by 1915, when they were logging on the Tulalip, they had gone to high lead logging, as opposed to his early pictures, in the early 1900s, when they were ground skidding, down on the Snoqualmie. So the technology they were using with the Everett Logging Company was very, very similar to the technology, we used when I was logging in Snohomish County in the 1970s. I was working on big Washington Iron Works steel tower portable spars, with large, Cummins engines, the same steel wire rope. You had a spar pole. The technology was all the same. More modern equipment when I was doing it, but very, very much the same. The names of the positions of the guys on the crew were much the same as when I logged. One thing that's really interesting about the photos of Roland's Everett Logging Company was the names of the individuals. Some of the photos are documented pretty well on who's in them, and a lot of the workers, a lot of the loggers were the local Tulalip Indians at the time. And if you look at their last names, it's the same last names you see on the reservation today: the Williamses, the Joneses, the Gobins, the Freibergs, a lot of the same people that you see out there today. A lot of the same families I remember back when they used to beach seine on the beach there between Mission Beach and Mission Head in the 1960s. If you go over there into the Back Bay, between the little communities of Totem and Hermosa, basically just to the north of where the Tulalip commercial gill netters are today, which is essentially located where the old marina used to be. When I was a kid in the 1960s there at Totem, if you go just to the north side of that, probably less than 100 feet, you can see the old pilings. If you look at the beach, you can see the old pilings of that old 1,600-foot trestle that went out into Tulalip Back Bay. And if you look at the pilings that are rotted off on the beach there, and you look at the spacing on how they drilled the piles to support the posts that supported the rails, and you compare them to that photo that I got from the Whatcom County Museum of History and Art, it's the exact same spacing. It's the trestle. You can see exactly where it was. And if you're on Marine View Drive there, just inland from that area, where Marine View Drive intersects with, I think it's Waterworks Road. That Waterworks Road was essentially built on the old main line for the Everett Logging Company's mainline logging road that ran north from that area. And from that road intersection, I guess it'd be just to the southeast quadrant of that intersection. If you look down there in the winter when the leaves have fallen off the trees, you can see that it's a through cut for an old railroad grade. And at Walt Tobinick in Marysville, he showed that to me. And probably about 10 years ago, he and I went out there with a metal detector and walked that old railroad grade. And sure enough, you could find the old railroad spikes left over from the original operation. And one of the photos that I have, I think was taken just a short distance inland from that. And it's a really neat photo with Roland standing in front of a Climax locomotive. And I think the photo was July 1915, when they were just getting started and just starting to haul logs off the property. That's probably my favorite photo from that collection. So I know that Roland had an interest in the Native Americans. From things that I've heard through my mom, and then also my mom's cousins, and some of the photos, at least one from when he was on a duck hunting trip back in Minnesota, near one of the Indian reservations back there, when my grandpa was just a little kid in the photos. And I know Roland had an interest in the Native Americans. I remember that he received, I think it might have been one of the tribes back in the Great Lakes states, but I'm not sure, and it could have been out here. He received a headdress, and my mom's cousin David had it when I was a kid, and I grew up just a block and a half down Hoyt from David, and I remember seeing the headdress that had belonged to Roland back then. I think David gave it to a museum. I can't remember which museum, but Roland definitely had an interest in the Native Americans. And today down in Olympia, there's a story pole. I would have called it a totem pole if I hadn't read and know better, but it's called a story pole, so apparently there's a difference. And it was a story pole carved by, I think it was William Shelton, and Roland selected the tree. And this was, I think, back in either the 1920s or 1930s, that the tree was selected, and William Shelton carved the story pole. And you can see it down there in Olympia today. It's near the Capitol building. I've got a picture in my living room that was in my grandpa's place. A picture with Roland, and sitting right in front of Roland is my mom and her sisters Judy and Marcia. And my mom was probably about a 5-year-old kid at the time. She was born in 1925, so I'm assuming the picture's around 1930. And the whole back row, I think it's 2 back rows, are all of Native Americans. And it's a beautiful picture, really, really high quality definition and contrast. It's really in great condition. And I don't have the information as to what the photo's all about, but it could be related to some, the 75th anniversary of the original 1855 Point Elliott Treaty signing. I know Roland was in Mukilteo in 1930 for the 75th anniversary of the 1855 treaty signing, and I've got some pictures of that too. And I just remember hearing from mostly people of my mom's generation. I can't remember if my grandfather talked about it, but Roland definitely had an interest and kind of a fascination in American Indian lore. And the last logging operation of Roland's that I'm really familiar with was called the Irving Hartley Logging Company. And I don't have very many pictures about the Irving Hartley Logging Company. I've got a few, and I don't recall my grandfather talking much about it. Most of the photos that I've got, I've stumbled upon through sources outside the family. But it was an operation that he owned with Joe Irving, and it operated out on the Olympic Peninsula to the west of Port Angeles, kind of on the north side of Lake Crescent, between Lake Crescent and the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And I think it began operation about 1923. And what it was an operation that they essentially purchased. During World War I, the United States government along the North Pacific coast, Northern California through Oregon, Washington, they developed with federal money 13 different logging operations, railroad logging operations, to access basically high quality spruce logs to support the production of the war aircraft during World War I. And this was one of the operations that the federal government had financed and built this railroad from the Port Angeles area west out towards the now defunct town of Twin. You can see on a map where Twin was, and you've got a couple small creeks running from the south to the north that drain into the Strait of Juan de Fuca, called the East and the West Twin River, and they had a camp, I think it was on the West Twin River. It was about a 200-man camp, and they were logging the northern slopes there of that ridge, which had a lot of high-quality Sitka spruce. And it was an operation that he and Joe Irving had, and they also owned a lot of timber. It would be to the southwest of there in the Solduck River drainage, which is one of my favorite steelhead streams. And over the last 25 years, I've spent a lot of time on the Solduck. I tell you, in that area, you can see from the stumps from the original logging back in the 20s and 30s. Just had a lot a lot of really high quality, large Douglas fir. And I think that might have been the last operation that Roland had. But I think by that time of his life, and I think they sold out in 1927. And by that time of his life, I think that his interest was in politics. He was already governor by then. And from looking at the photo collections in the family, from the very early years in 1902, 1904, when Roland first got out here, where he really documented the operations, in detail, and you compare it to the Irving Hartley Logging Company in the 1920s. I think by that time he had lost his interest. His passion really was politics, and that's what I think he put his focus and energy into. And I really don't have that much information on the Irving Hartley. I remember hearing from my brother Neil, who was talking to Tom Paul, which was Roland's daughter's husband, after Roland's daughter had died. That was my Aunt Mamie, who I knew her as. I think she died in 73, but her husband, Tom Paul, who I knew as Uncle Tom, I think he lived into the early 1990s. And my brother told me he remembers Tom Paul saying that, the financial arrangements when Roland, sold his interest in the Irving Hartley to Joe Irvings, the terms were very favorable to the Irvings. My grandfather, Edward, and his younger brother David were on the board of directors of the operation. Although I don't recall any stories from my grandfather about his involvement in that operation. But I think it's pretty apparent that by the 1920s, Roland's focus and his interest was the politics. One thing that I did find on the Irving Hartley, which was just one of the bookstores like Barnes and Noble or something, was a book, a photo collection of locomotives of Darius Kinsey. And in the collection, there was a picture of a locomotive that was owned at the time by the Crescent Logging Company, which was what the Irving Hartley Logging Company name was changed to after the Hartleys sold their interest in that operation. And when they sold, according to the article in this book of Kinsey photographs of locomotives, when they sold their interest, in addition to the logging company, they sold 500 million board feet of timber along the Solduck River Valley. And who they sold to was Bill Boeing, and also to Marilyn Ring. And I'm assuming that the reason Boeing might have been buying it, considering the time period, was possibly for supply for his, airplane company, which at that time probably was not all that big of a company yet. But Boeing was one of the people that purchased it, in addition to Marilyn Ring. And there was one other interest, which was an individual. I can't remember the guy's name, but he was a foreman that had worked for Joe Irving on some of his operations up in the North Fork of the Stillaguamish River drainage, where he had operations out of Hazel and Oso in the early part of the 20th century. But anyhow, Boeing was one of the buyers. Marilyn Ring is still in operation out there in that area today. I'm assuming they possibly still own that same area that Roland sold out of. But Marilyn Ring, before they moved their main operation out there to Pisht, they actually had an operation that was headquartered right down here on the waterfront between Muckleteal and Everett. And today the bridge that spans the little creek across the gully where their main rail line came down to Puget Sound. It's called Maryland Ring Creek, and I did find somewhere some information that Roland and David Clough both did own a small interest in Maryland Ring at that time, like 2 or 3%, real small interest in the company. But they they apparently had different interests, I think, in a lot of different companies. I think back in those early years, it was fairly common for people to be fairly diversified and have interests in a lot of different companies at any given time. And they would form companies just to log specific tracts, and then when the tract was logged out, essentially liquidate the company and the equipment. So it's real evident from the photo collections that as time went on, his passion was politics, and it wasn't running the business, the logging, or the mills, and politics is where his passion was. And I think his first major movement into politics, I think, was about 1910, when I believe he was elected mayor of Everett in 1910, and I think he went to the legislature in about 1914. Same year they bid to log the western side of the Tulalip Reservation. And he was elected governor in 1924, started serving in 25. And you can just see over the years as there was less documentation on the mills and the logging as time went on, because that's where his passion was, and that's where his interest was. I never met him myself. He died in 1952. I wasn't born until 56, so what I know of him is what I've heard through my grandfather, or my grandfather's brother, my mom's generation, her cousins, from my mom, and what I've read. There's been a lot written about him, because he was a controversial governor. I've read quite a number of his own writings, and it's real apparent that he was a very, strong-headed, determined individual, strong believer in personal responsibility, and a huge believer that life is what you make it, and it's all about self-discipline. And just as I read, I think just last week when I was looking at the website that Sanford has on on the Hartley Mansion, there was one link in there that went to a speech that I think he gave in 1928 to a graduating high school class somewhere here in Washington, and in his speech, one of his comments is that when it comes to life and what you're going to do with your own life, it's not about pussyfooting around the edges, but jumping right in and getting involved with it. And from everything that I know of him, that's the type of person that he was. He didn't believe in pussyfooting around the edges.